Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, all praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for having given us the opportunity to gather again, at least within this online platform, to discourse upon a very important matter, and in continuing our series of discussions on knowledge. Inshallah, in tonight's session, we will discuss the problem of the corruption of knowledge. Before, if we have time to continue on to discuss the distinguishing marks of the learned, the truly learned man, the alim, the ulama al-akhirah, and the ulama as-su, the false scholars. At any rate, before we can begin to appreciate the corruption of knowledge, let us perhaps, in order to understand what it means, relate what Professor Al-Attas had said about these problems besetting the Muslim society at large. He was saying that in a letter addressed to the Secretary General of the OIC in the 60s, that the problem besetting the Muslim Ummah in the political, economic, and the various spheres that has become manifest has its roots in the corruption of knowledge. Although it may be easily perceived, yes, meaning to say political corruption, yes, the problem of the corruption of political leadership is something that can easily be perceived. If you were to ask the question, what is corrupt about the leadership, then it becomes apparent that the corruption within the leadership is in reality something unseen, that is in the realm of knowledge, that produces, that manifests its effect in the socio-political realms. Furthermore, in a later work which he wrote on justice and the nature of man, in commentary of the verse, Inna Allaha ya'murukum an tu'addul amanat ila ahliha, that God commands you to return trust to its proper keepers. Wa idha hakamtum, and if you were to judge between men, an tahkumu bil adal, that you should do so with justice. He was saying that this amar, the command that Allah gives, assumes that mankind is no longer in a state of nature, as per the interview with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. Meaning to say, in the state of nature, every man is for himself. Everyone is in that state unkempt or uncultured, loss of adab, shall we say, suffer from an individual suffering inability to understand the proper places of things. That is the state of the corruption of knowledge. So, the corruption of knowledge, in other words, means that it is not that the person is necessarily ignorant, in the sense that he or she possesses no knowledge, but does not possess that type of knowledge that is required of the person to be able to put things in their proper places, to acknowledge and recognize the proper places of things. Or the corruption of knowledge can also mean, in a more, shall we say, in a more insidious manner, in a more evil sense, when the person knows the proper places of things but yet chooses to ignore it. So in this case, it is compounded. In the interest of trying to understand the proper meaning of knowledge in Islam, let us quote, or rather, let us paraphrase what Imam Abdullah bin Alawi al-Haddad has talked about in his Fusul Ilmiyah, or in the knowledge and wisdom, in which he said that knowledge are of various types. Some are more beneficial than others, some are more important than others. And he said that some knowledge or some types of information are important at a certain stage of your life and no longer important at another stage. Some types of knowledge are important to pursue for some individuals, but not for others. And they are positively, shall we say, harmful for some individuals. If Imam Haddad then said, if you wish to know what type of knowledge would be most beneficial to yourself, then you should conduct an intellectual exercise, a thought experiment. Consider that you have, say, only one more day to live, or should you so wish, maybe one more week to live. Within this thought experiment, ask yourself what sort of knowledge would be important. Of course, if your worldview to begin with is corrupted, or rather, if your worldview does not consider that the afterlife is something possible or certain, if your worldview rejects the existence of a creator, if your worldview does not know the proper place of man within creation, then perhaps you would say that the type of knowledge that I so need within this last week, well, perhaps is to enjoy myself while the time lasts. Because supposing your meditations upon death is such that you would just cross over, or rather you would just disappear from existence altogether. But we know that if we are so fortunate so as to have been educated in the proper principles of Tawheed, in the proper understanding of the worldview of Islam, in which the life of the Akhirah is more supreme, more important than the life of this world, that it is eternal and everlasting, that the afterlife is the one which is truly significant, then your last week on earth, or your last day on earth, will be spent trying to contemplate what you ought to know in order to be reconciled with your Creator and Lord, what you ought to know in order to serve your purpose as creation. And in this case, you would then prioritize the types of knowledge that would lead you into a safe passage of return. Because you know from the passages in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, Yawma la yanfa'u mal wala banun. On that day, neither wealth nor progeny will save a person, illa man atallaha biqalbin salim, except for he or she who returns to God with a sound heart. You will prioritize the actions that will purify your heart, that would revive it, that would restore its health and balance. So if then Imam Al-Haddad said, if you want to know what sort of knowledge would be most beneficial to mankind, that would restore it from the state of being corrupted, in that it is spent in pursuit of the pleasures and life of this world, he said then it is the type of knowledge which is most in accord, which is most alike to that which is and the one that quotes and repeats what is found in the book of God, the Quran, and what is found in the Sunnah, in the practices, in the statements and the silent confirmations of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And what are these type of knowledge that one ought to possess? Certainly, Islam acknowledges that there are various types of knowledge. There is the kind of knowledge that pertains to objects of this world. Islam acknowledges, if you look at the Aqaid An-Nasafi, for instance, a book that discusses the sources of knowledge in Islam, aside from the creedal statements, Imam An-Nasafi, as a representative of the Sunni theologians, mentioned that the Muslims acknowledge sense experience, reason, and true report as sources of knowledge. So therefore, we do accept that there are certain crafts. These are types of knowledge. History is a type of knowledge, and the various actions that we are predisposed towards our that leads us towards our success in this world, material or otherwise, are kinds of knowledge. So the type of knowledge which is found in the book of God, on the other hand, is the one that first discourses on the essence of God, Dhatillah, on his names and attributes, and then further on his actions. including his creation of the world and the effects of his creation. And furthermore, the Quran talks about or rather it contains the commands of God and his prohibition. The Quran talks about attributes that we ought to possess. Through its possession, it leads God to love us. For instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned وَالذَّاكِرِينَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا وَالذَّاكِرَاتِ, those who remember Allah a lot, those who mention God a lot, be they female or male, أَعَدَّ لَهُمْ, God promises them مَغْفِرَةً, forgiveness, وَأَجْرًا عَظِيمًا, and a reward which is magnificent. Or that he mentions إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ التَّوَّابِينَ وَيُحِبُّ الْمُتَطَهِّرِينَ, indeed God loves his servants who repent, and God loves the servant who purify themselves, and several other traits and characteristics which are desirable, which we ought to possess. This is what the Quran discusses about. And furthermore, the Quran also talks about the attributes which are loathful to God, that we ought not to possess, like avariciousness, envy, arrogance, the sort of things that will earn God's anger. So the discussion or the type of knowing that the Quran produces and the ahadith of the Prophet is such that it leads one first to the fear of God and to the recognition of his generosity and acknowledgement of his supreme position in the realm of existence, of which he is the creator. And then it leads one to be conscious of one's final destiny. It leads one to be repentant, and it leads one to become a better version of himself or herself. This is the type of knowledge that Imam Abdullah bin Alawi al-Haddad mentions that ought to be prioritized, that a person ought to repeat in his reading and reciting, because it produces a better state of individuals. So what then is the corruption of knowledge? It is when this type of knowledge, the sciences that improve one's individual state, is left aside. And Professor Naqib Al-Attas mentions that this category of knowledge which is praiseworthy, this is the type of knowledge which is known as the fardu ain, the category of knowledge which is considered a personal obligation. As for the other type of knowledge that is pursued by the generality of people, and especially because we are now one of the players but no longer the dominant one in the production of knowledge, academic or otherwise, the dominant civilization that now acts as the producer of knowledge is the Western civilization. Western civilization does not know any other category of knowledge other than the fardu kifayah, meaning to say that type of knowledge that is pursued only for the requirements of the world, or rather for the prosperity in this world. So therefore, since that is the only type of category of knowledge that is possible, that category of knowledge is allowed to grow tremendously. It is allowed to grow exponentially. It is pursued with activities of research, with nights which are spent in study, sleepless nights, I should add, spent in study and pursuit of that type of knowledge. And many spend their youth in pursuit of that study in order that they may obtain a secure position in society, to the detriment of the fardu ain. Meaning to say, where knowledge of themselves is concerned, where knowledge of God is concerned, knowledge of the state of their hearts is concerned, this is left in abeyance. This is now no longer considered of any importance. This is considered the thing of the past, shall we say. As a result, this unbalanced growth produces, perhaps we can still produce good citizens, but individuals who are incapable of purifying themselves, individuals who are corrupt in their nature. This is the corruption of knowledge. Also, we must mention, with regards to the understanding and definition of knowledge in Islam, our scholars in the Islamic intellectual tradition, perhaps more than any other intellectual tradition or religious tradition, has considered the discussion about knowledge of primary importance. In the Quran alone, as Professor Naqib Al-Attas mentions in Islam and Secularism, in the Quran alone there are over 800 references to knowledge. And then we know that the scholars have defined knowledge and given several definitions of it. For example, some of them mention that the Quran itself is knowledge. Why is that so? Because the revealed religion of Islam, being the revelation of God, considers that God has spoken. And God is the one who is in possession of perfect knowledge. And of the knowledge that He shares with mankind, that He imparts to mankind via the Archangel Jibril through the tongue of our Prophet, He shares with us the type of knowledge which produces certainty, which produces a certain type of existential mood, shall we say, because now we recognize our place in the realm of existence and in relation to God. So many scholars consider the Quran itself to be the primary object of knowledge. So therefore, they spend their labors in writing exegesis, tafasir, in order to understand the subtle nuances that is contained in the Quran. Not, of course, not discounting the aspects of the Quran which are revealed in such clarity. Furthermore, the ahadith of the Prophet, because the Prophet Muhammad is the interpreter of the Quran par excellence. The Prophet Muhammad's own inner constitution is the Quran. He is the one that the Quran praises as being the standard guide for mankind. So, likewise, the scholars then develop the genre of the commentaries on ahadith. Furthermore, some of them consider that the Sharia, which is the path that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed unto mankind in order to reach safety, as the prime knowledge. So therefore they develop and they labored in order to understand and to practice the Sharia. This is what they have understood as knowledge. And the corruption of knowledge is when this extremely rich tradition is ignored to the detriment of the peoples in our time, and instead preferring our own opinions, our own preliminary searches into such realms such as existence and why we are here and so on and so forth, looking to our own intelligence and looking to the proofs, shall we say, of scientific research, which are still tentative in conclusion to determine the answers to the ultimate questions. Of course, some of the scholars consider that it is not necessary to define knowledge due to the intimate nature of knowledge to ourselves. Knowledge is the attribute of man that is known intimately, because we have knowledge of knowledge, shall we say. But they gave descriptions of what knowledge is, amongst which it is, shall we say, that knowledge is al-i'tiqad. It is a type of belief which is established. And this established belief corresponds to the reality. That's knowledge. Knowledge also is understood as to be able to conceive something as it really is. Meaning to say, to possess a conception of something as it really is. It is to understand the relation of something within the system of meanings to other things. It is to understand the source of something and its consequences. Knowledge is what removes ignorance in oneself. Knowledge is also that which removes the hiddenness, or rather, knowledge exists or subsists in a person when he is no longer ignorant about the reality of something that he is concerned about. And also, as Professor Naqib Al-Attas himself would have preferred, the definition of knowledge that he gave is the arrival of meaning in the soul, and as well as the soul's arrival at meaning. Which is to say that knowledge is an internal attribute to mankind. Knowledge is not found in books. Knowledge is not found in the keyword searches in internet search engines. Rather, that knowledge is the attribute within a living spirit. And while all these definitions are helpful, we have to be wary that they concern various objects of knowledge. They concern objects of knowledge of the things of the realm of the sensible world, and they also pertain to the realms of the unseen. We consider that knowledge of God is not only possible and attainable, it is something that can be arrived at through worship of the Lord, provided, of course, we have been given the prerequisite knowledge in order to obtain that type of higher knowledge. So knowledge of God, knowledge of the things pertaining to the realm of the unseen, such as the akhirah, meaning to say the afterlife. How is it arrived at? That it depends on the latent capacity of the individual, as well as the preparation that is being given to the individual, being done by the individual. First, he or she must be provided with the basics of religious knowledge, the Arkanul Islam and the Arkanul Iman, meaning to say you have to know the science of mu'amalah, or the science of action that is required in order to approach God, and the performance of such deeds with sincerity will grant you the proximity, or ever approaching a proximity to come to know God. So since now we consider that knowledge of God is possible, that Islam also contains the knowledge of achieving the virtues. I remember that Professor Naqib Al-Attas, during one of the Saturday night lectures at Cassis, was once asked, is political wisdom and moral wisdom, are these things possible? And can they be taught? His answer was, yes, political virtue and moral virtue, they can be taught, and they are part of the religious sciences. Because in Islam, certain virtues of a higher order, things such as patience, gratefulness or gratitude to God, sabar wa shukur, things such as zuhud, and fear of God, longing and intimacy with God, shall we say, pleasure in devotion, all these things are possible. So, since all these things are possible, and you can strive to arrive at them, and since also Islam teaches us how to treat the sicknesses of the soul, things such as envy and arrogance and so on. So therefore, this prepares us for the second half of the discourse on the evils of knowledge. Since knowledge encompasses all these things that we have mentioned, what then are the evils of knowledge? Or to what extent can knowledge be corrupted in an individual? We say that knowledge is corrupted in the individual if the knowledge that subsists in the heart does not perform its proper function. Because knowledge is meant to be a guide to mankind. It is a light that reveals to the person the proper places of things. Supposing one was told that stealing was wrong, and he proceeds to steal, so therefore that person has not received benefit from his knowledge. Or Imam Al-Ghazali gives a more dramatic example in the Ayyuhal Walad, in which he said that supposing there was a warrior who is very well skilled in self-defense. Supposing he has an array, an arsenal of swords and weapons housed on his vehicle. But yet, when suddenly a ferocious lion approaches him, he stands still, neither using the weapon at hand nor the skills that he has accumulated over the years. Would he be in a position to defend himself against the lion? Imam Al-Ghazali said no, because he does not practice the knowledge that he has in order to protect himself. Furthermore, of a person who knows the sufficient amount of pharmacology, sufficient amount of knowledge of drugs and its effects, or knowledge of medicine and its effects on the body, and knows also sufficiently symptoms of his body that shows that he is not in a state of well-being. and he knows the remedy, but does not take the remedy, can he consider himself cured? Certainly not. So similarly, of the evil of knowledge is when knowledge that reveals to you the proper places of things does not benefit the possessor. And why could this be possible? So Imam Al-Ghazali mentions of the trait of the false scholars. The most fundamental one, the first that he mentioned, is that the scholar or the learned man ought to know that the akhirah is worth more than this world. And that is established. First, through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's statement in the Quran, wal akhiratu khairun wa abqa. Indeed, the afterlife is better and it is more permanent. And various other verses. The pleasures of this world, on the other hand, is fleeting. It is temporary. Every other pleasure in this world has the possibility of contamination. If you consider it properly, every pleasure in this world has the possibility of contamination. You can talk about brotherly love, whose possibility of contamination comes from betrayal. Passionate love like that, likewise, has the possibility of betrayal or lack of luster after a while. Food, yes, can possibly be contaminated. That can lead to, say, food poisoning. Clothes, yes, they wear out, and other things, yes, gradually like that. Or if they don't bring in the harms directly to the individual, then they harm the individual through the covetousness of others. They harm the individual in that now the individual can no longer know whether the friendship of the one who pretends to be his friend is for his sake or for the goods, the material goods that he possesses. So therefore, since we can at least conceive of the contaminating effects of any possible good in this world, nothing of this world is of such permanence that is worth full pursuit. And furthermore, there is the problem of human desires, in which the pleasure of something that is sought diminishes. Yes, I mean to say, once you attain to that pleasure, you will require a greater dosage or a higher type of pleasure continuously. And then there are so many things that produces and induces pain, which is why when we consider the ethical philosophies of the Stoics and the Epicureans, they teach, the Stoics at least teach us to be, that happiness is some form of tranquility, lack of movement, lack of desire. That is truly happiness. Whereas the Epicureans teach us, for example, that even greater than pleasure is the avoidance of pain. That the avoidance of pain ought to be prioritized than the pursuit of positive pleasures. Now, all these things are spoken of by human individuals who understood that the pleasures of this world are full of the things that is destructive. So if this is known, and for them, they know this while the world is all they know. But for the Muslim scholar, they know about this world in such a manner, and they also know the akhirah, which is superior, and they know that their Lord, yes, their Lord has duties that is commanded to them. So if they would pursue the world and they would sacrifice their akhirah, theirs is a case of hypocrisy. Theirs is a case of truly deserving of the punishment of God. And furthermore, as Imam Al-Ghazali was mentioning also, that God, based on the verse of the Quran, that God does not place within the bosom or the chest of a man two hearts. In other words, that if a person pursues the afterlife, he will not be interested in this world, or he will be less interested in this world. On the other hand, if he spends his labor in pursuit of this world, then that would be at the cost of his akhirah. He said that it is like a balanced scale. Like if you were to put the weight on one side, it will be lighter on the other side. Or it is like, or it is, since it requires concentration, it takes away concentration from one end to the other end. So therefore, the true scholars who have been given the knowledge of the superiority of the akhirah of this world should be truly cautious about their pursuit of pleasures in this world. And furthermore, we know through the other argument that Imam Al-Ghazali has provided earlier on in the Book of Knowledge, in which he mentioned that of the things which are pursued in this world, knowledge is highest. Because, yes, supposing we talk about things such as wealth, honor, position, companionship, knowledge, everything pertains to the goods of the body. But knowledge pertains to the higher realm. Knowledge pertains to the, first, not only it is desirable for its own sake, because it leads one away from the state of ignorance, it is also desirable because it secures true happiness in the akhirah. And furthermore, the Prophet ﷺ was saying also, in identifying the false scholars, he was saying that you should not pursue knowledge in order to vie with the learned, nor to dispute and silence the insolent. It is also, knowledge is not to be sought in order to win the favor of and popularity, and whoever does so will be led to doom. The Prophet ﷺ also said that he is more afraid in his community, the Muslims, that is, greater is his fear of the false scholars in his community compared to his fear of the corrupting effects of the Dajjal or the Antichrist. Also, we know that having knowledge alone, without sincerity, without practicing knowledge, is not something that is praiseworthy. Because, as it is mentioned in the Quran, in the similitude of the Jews at the time of the Prophet, it was said of them that they knew the Prophet better than they knew their sons, or as they knew their sons. يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. Yet they did not believe in him. So what does that knowledge benefit them? It does not benefit them. And suffice it is for us to say what Hasan al-Basri said about the false scholars. Yes, he said that the penalty of seeking the world for a man of knowledge is the death of the hearts. And in another statement, it is said that the first thing that will be taken away from the learned man who pursues the world is the pleasure of intimate converse with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, we have now gone past the 40-minute mark or 45-minute mark. In the remaining time, I would like to open if you have any questions, inshallah. Any questions? If there are no questions, let me just perhaps mention several more sayings of the dangers of false scholars. Hasan al-Basri's comment is, he said that do not combine knowledge of the learned man and brilliant thoughts of the wise, yet conducting yourself in the way of the fools. Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab was saying that What he is wary about are the hypocritical scholars, al-alim, who is affected by nifaq, hypocrisy. So some of his companions, some of his friends asked him, how can a person be learned while at the same time be a hypocrite? Now this is a man whose knowledge does not extend beyond verbal profession, because he does not practice what he knows. And Fudail ibn Iyad mentioned that he only pities three groups of people in this world. One is the mighty man who has fallen. Two is the rich who has become poor. And three, the learned man who has become a laughing stock. In other words, because despite trying to convince others that he is a man of the afterlife, that he is a man who knows God, that he dresses in such a way so as to display his desire for the life of the akhirah, yet his tongue and his actions reveals otherwise, that he is desirous for possession. And interestingly, Imam Al-Ghazali was saying that do not think that for the scholars that wealth alone would tempt them, because some of them are able to overcome the temptation of wealth. Others are able to overcome the temptation of the opposite gender. And yet even others are able to overcome the temptation of position. And all these things are certainly very dangerous, because some of the scholars mention about how that we should be wary of the scholars who frequent the house of the rulers, because that means he is a thief, as one of the companions said, or he is a highway brigand who robs people from their Lord. But yet the finer test to the scholars is when he desires, shall we say, he enjoys the pleasure of sharing knowledge. Yes, the pleasure of sharing knowledge, not for the sake of Allah, but for the sake of being known as a person who is knowledgeable. In other words, he as Imam Al-Ghazali was also mentioning, that when bear witness that when a person says haddathana, we have heard from so and so, we have heard from so and so, that is his double speak, because internally he's saying come listen to me, for I have sat with so and so. Or when a person who enjoys being able to answer, to respond to questions, that is his pleasure of being distinguished, shall we say. So these are all fitnah, these are tests. That if the person, and another I think beautiful quote that is cited by Imam Al-Ghazali is how the test of scholars, yes, is when the learned man, the test of the learned man is when he loves speech more than he does listening. So one should be wary of such shall we say, self-professed scholars. Do we have any questions? All right. I think Sister Nurul Ain here asked, how do we deal with a false scholar who has taken our heart away? How do we confront that person? In this case, it is about a scholar who has taken our research, hard work, and made it as hers. Allahu Akbar. How do I approach this with hikmah and grace? Well, of course, in our time, this problem has become compounded. One of the things that I like to mention about the history of our scholars, especially in the Malay world, is how Professor Said Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas mentioned that amongst the first scholars to have broken the wall of anonymity was Sheikh Hamzah Al-Fansuri. Amongst the first scholars who have done that. That means to say that before him there were other numerous scholars who wrote without mentioning their names. Even some later scholars, although others amongst the world of scholars could easily identify who the authors of some of these scripts were, but they signed it as just Al-Faqir Ilallah. in order to try to preserve their sincerity with God. Imam Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad was once confronted by a person, or rather was once met by a person who told Imam Haddad that he wants to build a masjid. He said, do you consider it a charitable act? Imam Haddad said, I think you shouldn't build that masjid. So he was saying, why? Imam Haddad said, well, if you insist on building that masjid, then build that masjid, but do not have any of the recognition. Would you still build it? He said, if that was so, then I wouldn't want to build the masjid. He said, then don't build the masjid. Of course, this does not answer your question directly. But amongst the challenges of our time, certainly, is the plagiarism. And Professor Naqib Al-Attas himself, he mentions the one of the hadith that we heard through our teachers, Prof. Wan, Professor Zaini, that he likes to repeat the hadith about this ummah will be, will have champions who will protect it from, say, the three, shall we say, three groups that corrupt it. One is the ta'wil al-jahilin, the interpretation of the ignorant. And secondly, the extremism of the extremists. And then thirdly, the, shall we say, the plagiarism of the plagiarists. Of course, plagiarism is a major source of corruption. And I believe Professor Alparslan Achigench also once he shared with us that amongst the major crimes of scholarship is plagiarism. And Professor Al-Attas, in clarifying the dangers inherent in plagiarism, is that one aside from stealing the right of a person, it is also to distort an idea, since original ideas are to be interpreted by the ones who have thought it through, because we know that the final product, or the product which is written by the scholar, is not everything that the scholar knows, but the result of long contemplation, in which the scholar arrives at the hikam, shall we say, as a result of long contemplation and a thinking about the relevant cases, the relevant sources, and so on. In other words, this is stealing. So, how do we do this with hikmah and grace? Well, I can only show you the example, or rather I can only share with you the example of our own teachers. Professor Wan and several others who themselves were victims of plagiarism, and Professor Al-Attas himself also, that you should claim what is rightfully yours. Of course, through hikmah is the best. In the case of Professor Al-Attas, he mentioned that a particular scholar who he tried to maintain a good opinion of for a long time, he called the person several times, wrote letters, to which the person did not respond properly, until after a while, when he suspected that this person is plagiarizing, he decided to publish his work elsewhere, while this person has already done that. But beyond that, what can we do? Of course, if you choose to take legal action, that is still within your right also. Our teachers, like Professor Wan, once a person was caught stealing his work, everything about it. He called the person, and the person tried in a manner trying to save himself, saying that all knowledge belongs to God. So why should you claim that to be yours? So Prof. Wan then answered, well, if you claim that all knowledge is belonging to God, why should you write your name upon it and lay claim upon that? In other words, well, ours is a very difficult time. We should always, try to preach honesty, and we should remain honest in a condition that people are lying, because for ourselves we know that the ultimate judge is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we should try to preserve our purity. But for others, I mean, aside from taking the recourse which is available, what else can we do? I hope that answers your question, or at least that is how I would approach it. Are there more questions? Well, if there is um, let me share another experience, I suppose, if there are no more questions, and perhaps if there are no more, then we will close in 5 minutes or so. Once when I used to lecture somewhere, I saw two identical essays in my class. I set an exam, or rather an assignment question, through which I said that it will give them it will serve as a sort of plusage, that they will not be penalized if they didn't do it, but if they did it, that could add, say, maybe 5 marks towards their final exam or something like that. I asked them to write their personal experience of attending the class, of studying, say, philosophy or something like that. Then while going through some of the essays, I found one essay which I really liked because it was written very well. And then I encountered the other one which is exactly the same. So the resolution was that either one of them is cheating or both of them are cheating, because it is virtually impossible for them to come up with this with this very polished answers, or rather that of such similarity. So I called them separately. One of the students, in order to know whether he or she truly was the author of what was given to me, I asked, well, I applaud you for such a perfect answer, I said, but pray tell me, since he mentioned there one famous philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, I believe, and I said, well, did you really read the structures, of scientific revolution, and what do you really think about it? He said, I've never heard of the author. I've never heard of the book. Then I said, it is clearly that you have lied, because you in that article, it is as if you really knew it. So he then finally, when there's no way that he can he can defend himself, the student then said, well, he actually took it off a blog, and that solves the situation, the riddle, shall we say, because the other person also did the same. They simply typed the question and then they produced it. I said, well, how will this, I asked for a personal reflection. It could be a half a page, but this is truly, I corrected the student. But this is the type of mentality, that we should combat in our society, because if it begins like this, it can snowball until it has serious repercussions in our community. Because if you are unjust with knowledge, how could you be just with other people? And with that, since I suppose we have given ample time for those who want to ask questions, we shall close our session, and inshallah hope to meet again. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.